Good evening. It's time for us to go ahead and continue our walk through the Old Testament as we have been doing, kind of looking at an overview, you could say, of the Bible. Fits very well with what we talked about in the sermon this morning. Jesus beginning with Moses and going through the prophets demonstrated how everything in the scriptures was all about him. And that's kind of the point of what we're doing on these Sunday nights, is to demonstrate this very fact. While we're doing it, we are creating a timeline that will help us to see where the various pieces fall into play. And right now, we begin really with creation, right? And then at some point, what happens? All right, you have the fall. And so you have the fall, and where do we find this? What passage? Okay, Genesis 3, the first of the key passages of the Old Testament. So then you continue from there. You have the very next, Genesis chapter 4, which we will look at in the near future, actually. With the Cain and Abel story, you have then the Noah story, the flood narrative, the Babel narrative, and all of this really, chapters 1 through 11, create kind of an introduction, a prologue to the story of the entire Bible, until what passage? Okay, very good. Abraham, but what book, chapter? All right. So Genesis 12, you have the promises to Abraham, and what were those three promises we focused on? Okay, there would be a great nation, they would be given the land, and through his seed all the families of the earth would be blessed. Nation, land, and seed. Then you have the rest of the patriarchs after Abraham. Who's the next patriarchs? Joshua? Do you remember who's Abraham's son? Isaac. Someone said Isaac. Very good. Oh, good job, Annalie. All right, so Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. And then Jacob had a bunch of sons. Who was the son who brought them to Egypt? Joshua? Joseph. There you go. Very good. So they come down to Egypt, and then they become enslaved, and then we have a time period of roughly 400 years or so, and they are finally brought out of Egypt. What date do at least I give? And I know there's discussion on this, but what date do I give for the Exodus? Anybody remember? All right, 1450, approximately 1450 BC. And in 1450, they are led to what mountain? All right, they come to Sinai, and what do they do at Sinai? Excellent, Joshua, that's exactly right. They make their covenant at Sinai. They ratify their covenant. What's the book, chapter? Genesis 24 is kind of at the end of Abraham's story, right there beginning with Isaac. Did you mean? No, yeah, you had it right. Exodus 24, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, very good. So Exodus chapter 24, they enter into their covenant. They build the tabernacle through the rest. Don't forget what happened in chapter 32, Exodus 32. Yep. Okay, he breaks the tablets because they did what? All right, remember they made an idol. They had the golden calf incident, Exodus chapters 32 through 34. And then they build the tabernacle after that. They restore things, they rebuild, they build the tabernacle, give laws. Then God is finally ready to take them into the land. Do they go? No. They decide they can't do it. Numbers chapters 13 and 14. That's where they say, we would rather what? All right, we'd rather die in the wilderness. And God said, okay, if that's what you want to do, then that's what you'll do. And they wander for 40 years until that generation dies out. Then you have a new generation who comes in, right? And this generation, about a 40-year period of time later, they are led by whom? Joshua, what was that? Joshua, oh yeah, okay, yeah, very good, Joshua. Yeah, they're led by Joshua. They enter in the land. This is what we talked about last week. Remember, the first city they conquered was Jericho. What did they do with Jericho? Okay, the walls came down and they were able to conquer it. Very good. And then what did they do with the city? They burned the city. Why? No, actually it was a really good city. Why would they burn the city? All right, because this is a first fruits sacrifice. Seems to be the picture. This is a whole burnt offering to God. All the valuable stuff is left in the city as an offering, as a sacrifice. Then you have the mishap at Ai that takes place because of whom? Achan, right? Remember, Achan took the stuff he wasn't supposed to take, and it caused the problem at Ai. Finally, it's figured out, and Achan's family was Achan. Remember when they then stoned them, heaped stones upon them, left them in the valley of trouble because he had troubled Israel. And then the narrative continues. The Gibeonites, what did they do? They deceived, they tricked Israel into entering into a covenant with them. And because of that, then you had the fights in the south, which they won, the fights in the north, which they won. The very last city that's conquered in Joshua was Hatzor. And what did they do at Hatzor? They burned it. Why would they do that? All right, another sacrifice. It seems to be a whole burnt offering. The very first, the very end, kind of like the morning, the evening sacrifices type of an idea. So that brings us then through the time period of Joshua, which is what we covered last week. So now we enter into Judges, and I've been going back and forth all week. How well do I want to cover Judges? Not very well. I'm going to save a detailed look at Judges for an adult class because Judges is an adult book. It is not a kid's book. It's not a book intended for kids, at least the way that we look at it. At the very least, it's PG-13, kind of R-rated. And there's a lot of sexual innuendo taking place throughout and various references to things. We'll save a detailed look for a time when maybe we don't have the same full, complete audience that is obviously soaking things up very well and retaining things very well and doing a great job with that. So we'll briefly mention some things as we look at this, but it is important to see from the very beginning as you go to Judges chapter 1, and let's see here. How do I want to conquer this one? Well, let me start off with chapter 2, and I'm going to go to verse 8. We're going to move backwards to 1 and look at some of the stuff that's taking place here. But I want to see chapter 2, verse 8. It says, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. They buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance, and Timnah-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And then what happened? If you're following along in verse 10, what happened after that generation's gathered to their fathers? All right. Another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord nor the work that he had done for Israel. And this becomes an important aspect of what's going to happen moving through Judges. Now, even then, this is all set up in the first couple chapters, where you have a phrase that kind of gets repeated again and again and again. And I know I'm going to miss some of them. That's just the nature of this. But I'm going to start in verse 27. It says in verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beit Shean and its villagers, or its villages, and we'll just kind of skip ahead. Verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Verse 31, Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko. 33, Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beit Shemesh. 34, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to even come into the plain. First of all, why are they driving anybody out? Didn't we take care of this in Joshua? I thought they already drove everyone out and conquered the land in Joshua, didn't they? Well, did they? Okay, all right. So John said they captured the flag, put it up on top of the city, but the people are still there. Yeah, what did they defeat before in Joshua? They were victorious over armies and kings. They do not, by and large, conquer cities. You know, the cities are still there. They basically take out the armies, they take out the kings, and then it's time to now divvy up the land, divide up all of the land, and then he says, now you go in and drive the inhabitants out of the cities, out of the places. Take houses, live in houses that were not yours, harvest vineyards that you did not plant, all of that had been talked about before. So in Judges, what they're doing is they are finishing the conquest, because conquering the land is not done. It's not completed. It's not finished. Everybody sees that, right? We have a tendency to think of Joshua as the book where they conquer the land. They don't. They beat armies up. They divide up the land. And then you turn the page to Judges, and how well do they do actually conquering the land? What was the phrase that you saw over and over and over again? All right. They did not, Dick says. They failed to drive out the inhabitants of. They failed to drive out the inhabitants of. They failed to drive out the inhabitants of. In fact, you go all the way to Dan. What does it say about Dan? Say it again. Yeah, the tribe of Dan was pushed back. So they didn't even get a foothold. At least with the others, they came in and they were somewhat victorious, but they didn't drive everyone out. And in some instances, they made the people of the land their servants. In some instances, they just kind of commingled together. In other instances, they became the servants of the people of the land. For Dan, they went to their place. They didn't get any of it. They didn't even, make the first headway. How does this happen? Okay. what would you have anticipated was going to happen? No. What would you anticipate based on everything that we've seen, what we've read so far? When they go into the land, what do you expect is going to happen? Okay, there will be a war. That they're going to go in, and God is going to kind of flick all the people out, and they'll be able to take this land. That's not what happens. What does this maybe indicate? All right, Julia said a lack of faith on the part of the people. Maybe there's not as much faith behind the people who are going in to drive out the inhabitants of the land than we might like to think. Because what we've seen is when the people go with God, and they're going, with God as part of them, they have no problems. But when they attempt to do things without God and without faith, they run into all kinds of obstacles. That's the pattern we've seen so far, and I think that's exactly what's taking place here. We've got a real situation that's happening where there is a lack of faith to begin with. Therefore, is it surprising that when this generation who crossed the Jordan River on dry ground and conquered Jericho by the walls coming down, as they die out, if this is the same generation that doesn't have enough faith to finish the job, is it any wonder that there's a generation that's going to come up who doesn't know the Lord or the things that He's done for Israel? Does that make sense, how that could happen? You're starting on a really bad spot. Now, let me ask this question before we move on, because it's important. When it says a generation arose who did not know the Lord, what does that mean? Everybody's like, oh man, he set up the trick question here. Give me one of those easy ones from earlier. I'll take some of that low-hanging fruit again, right? Okay, doesn't mean there are people who don't know God, and that's another question. What does it mean to know God, John? Mm-hmm. And these people did not know God that way. I think you're spot on because their parents had a weakness in this area. When their kids came in, second generation is pretty complete in quantifying and multiplying it out by two, if you will. It's always in our history, in our lifetime, it seems to be worse than it was. If when their parents had a lacking in our country to do what God did, then their kids double that. Not always true. Not always true, because sometimes the kids will come up, a generation will come up, and they will believe in God, and God will bless that. Yeah, you're giving me way too much. We don't have a mic on you. I'm going to have to repeat all of this back. The gist of what John was just saying, we're dealing with a second generation type of a scenario, and it's oftentimes if there is any lack of faith in any shape or form in the first generation, it is exacerbated in the following generation, and then you continue to go down. Am I paraphrasing okay, John, with what you were saying? Did I miss anything important? Okay. Okay, well, hold on one second. It's important. Now Mike's there.
I think it's important to know that when that phrase is used, it picks out people in the Old Testament that knew God. I think and it relates to their faith in action. Mm-hmm. They would not set him aside like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
Yeah, very good. Julia as well has a hand up.
It seems to be referring to the relationship. They didn't have a relationship with the Lord. And the phrase that verse ends with, that they didn't know the work that he had done for Israel, it I mean, it seems like they just hadn't been told
Okay.
what anything about the covenant, or very little about the covenant relationship that God had done for their people throughout history.
Okay. Now, to counter that in some kind of a way, you go all the way towards the end of Judges, and you have the narrative with Jephthah, and Jephthah actually gives a really good recounting of Israel's history with God. He seems to know an awful lot while he's, talking to their enemies, and he's like, what's your beef with us? You're really the problem, not us, because if you go back and look at how it all happened, and it's actually kind of impressive. He's towards the end of this, so they knew God, right? They knew the stories. They knew the things that God had done. They're able to recount them. Throughout here, they call upon the name of Yahweh. Deborah is a prophetess of Yahweh's. So how can he say then that this generation doesn't know God or the works that he's done for Israel? I mean, it seems like they know it. Hold on, Jeff. You got a mic coming to you. Go ahead.
Well, what comes to mind to me is Deuteronomy 6 and verse 7, where he tells them, you talk about me. You talk about me when you're busy, and you keep these memories before you constantly and from generation to generation. And is that part of what their issue is here, is they've not done that?
All right. Yeah. Yes. And I'm not discounting what Julie was saying, what John was saying. I'm trying to show the other side of this, that they obviously have heard the stories. But I want to key in on something Julia said. The relationship, it seems, is not there. And that's what this is ultimately so much about, is the knowing God, is having a relationship with God. It's the same kind of knowing that a husband and wife have with one another. That's the intimate idea of knowing, having a relationship. And as far as knowing the works of God, what are the wondrous works that God has done for Israel? This one's the easy one. What's God done? Yeah, he brought him out of Egypt, brought him across the Red Sea on dry ground, defeated the kings on the trans side of the Jordan. They crossed the Jordan on dry ground, right? The walls of Jericho, all these other things. They experience the wonders of God on a regular basis. But then without a continued relationship, do they continue to experience the wonders of God in the same type of a way? Some of that tends to go away. Now, they do have some experience because, as is explained here in chapter 2, and this is where y'all are right with me. Y'all could probably take me through this without any kind of a problem. We have what's often referred to as the Judges what? All right, the Judges cycle, right? And that starts with everything is fine until what? What happens? All right, Israel sins. And then what happens? But that's sinning. What does God then do? Okay, but when they sin, what does God do? He raises an oppressor. Probably should choose words that I know that I'm spelling correctly. And what happens when he raises an oppressor? All right, Israel cries out. So what does God then do? All right. Now let's talk about the word judge here. Does that mean that God is sending a person who's got a wig on and a gavel and a gown? No, right? Judge is, I don't know, it's not a good English word to use because we don't think of it that way in the way when they first started using this word, I guess. A better word would be a deliverer, because that's what the judges in the book of Judges, that's their predominant thing they do. God raises them up and they deliver Israel so that Israel is fine again for X number of years until what happens? Until they sin, lather, rinse, repeat, right? This is what happens time and again. There's multiple judges that are mentioned. Unless the number that is just off in my mind, I believe there are 12 judges who are mentioned in the book of Judges. I get that number wrong a lot because there is one who is not a judge, but he's in the list, and he shouldn't be. He has absolutely zero business being in our list of judges. That's Abimelech. There is no reason for us to ever, in any way, shape, or form, include Abimelech in our list of judges. He is the horrible ending of the Gideon story. He is not his own judge. So, in case you've got that, listing in your mind, and you've had it since you were a kid, try your hardest to erase Abimelech from that, because he does not deserve to be there. So that either takes it from 13 to 12 or 12 to 11, and without going through them in my head right now to tell you that would be the case. We also usually include two judges who aren't actually in Judges, Eli and Samuel, who are going to come in 1 Samuel. They are not part of the Judges narrative, which is why I don't include them. For whatever reason, yes, we would consider them judges as they show up later, but for the Judges narrative itself, they're not there. They're not a part of it. It ends with Samson. There are 6 major judges that actually have narratives. Othneil, Ehud, Deborah, which really is supposed to be, all right, Barak, right? And then Gideon. I should be asking you guys to name these off. Who's after Gideon? What? Next major judge after Gideon? Jephthah, yeah. I was setting you up for someone to say Abimelech. I was just like, come on, somebody throw out Abimelech after what I just said. That would have been hilarious. But, all right, so you have, thank you. You have Jephthah, and then finally Samson at the end. These are the major judges, and then there are some minor judges that are also thrown in there. But these are the ones who have stories. Here's the interesting thing about this. We often call this the judges cycle. I think a better term for this would be the judges spiral. Because, yes, they go through this again and again and again, but if you follow these stories, are y'all familiar with all of these stories? Othneil, pretty good guy. He's a pretty good guy, isn't he? He's a great guy. I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say Caleb's nephew. He's related to Caleb. I know that. And so, he's a really good guy, actually decent, love story, love interest, everything else. This is good. What about Ehud? Pretty good guy? Well, there's a question, is he left-handed, or is that a military phrase that's specifically used to say he was trained with using a left hand for assassin purposes, which seems to be the case. The word left-handed is usually used in military terminology elsewhere. And so I think what that means is that he is a very specific military, like, special ops type of a military type of guy when it mentions that. And yeah, there are some questionable tactics, things that happen in his story. This is a favorite for the kids because they really enjoy listening or envisioning the globs of fat from Eglon that cover the dagger as it goes. Oh, I'm sorry, wait, we were skipping. Yeah, we need to get it down. All right. So forget the fact that I talked about the dagger going in and the fat rolls covering the hilt even of the dagger. Just strike that from the record, okay? You all forgot that? All right. But then you get to Deborah, as far as the judge is concerned. Is she a pretty good judge? She is, right? What's the problem? She wasn't supposed to be the judge. Barak's the guy who's supposed to be the judge, but what did he do? What did he do? He was kind of cowardly with it. She comes to tell him, and he's like, well, I'm only going to do this if. Let me put some conditions on this. I want you to be there with me. And she says, all right. But a woman is going to be the one who's going to get the credit for all of this. Whether that be referring to Deborah or who else in this story? All right. Remember Jael, the one who actually drove the tent peg through the head of Sisera? There we go again. We're getting into all of the gruesome, nasty things, right? Yeah. By the way, that story and the retelling of the story in the next chapter where you see the poem, that's one of the reasons that if you take a deep dive into it, you don't want to do this story with kids. There's a lot of things going on there. So, Gideon. What about Gideon? I mean, so far, these have been pretty good people. You get to Gideon. Is he a good guy? Well, don't go there yet. I'm not going to repeat what Sean said because he's given the answer away right away. All right, does he have some good moments? Yeah, doesn't he? I mean, how does it start off, though? Anybody remember how the story of Gideon starts off? Yeah, Josie just did a little enactment here. You have him taking care of, threshing the wheat and all of that. Where? On the threshing floor? It's in a wine press. And so, if I were doing the movie of Gideon, I would kind of have this, long distance shot of a wine press in the distance and everything. And then all of a sudden, you'd see a little head poke up, look around, and disappear. And then as the camera's coming forward, you'd see some stuff fly in the air and chaff blowing away. And then a couple seconds later, as we're getting closer, you'd see the head pop up again, and then go back down, and then it would be repeated. Why is he doing that? Is that where you're supposed to thresh your wheat? In a wine press? Why is he doing it in a wine press? No, it's a good thought, though. He's hiding. Yeah, he is scared of the oppressor. And because he is scared, he's scared of what they will do, he's kind of cowardly doing this. And so that's the very first look that we get, is a coward who at the same time is kind of ingenuitive with what he's doing, right? So that's where we begin. he is told to eradicate, the idols in the city. And does he do it? Yeah, he goes in and breaks them down, right? When does he do it? In the middle of the night, right? So again, he's kind of doing what he's supposed to do. At the same time, there's a whole cowardly element involved as well. You keep on going through the story, and remember when he was told that he was going to be the one? What did he request? Yeah, the sign, right? Put the fleece out. He's like, make the dew, on the fleece, not on the fleece, all of that. Made it, go through it twice. And God was willing to do this. But again, we're kind of getting mixed messages about this guy. So you go into the story itself, and he gathers with him a large gathering. What does God tell him? All right, it's too many people. And so the first thing, anybody who wants to go home can go home. And then they are left with, and the number is totally, I want to say it's 10,000. All right. I knew it was either 10 or 20. All right, so they're left with 10,000 people, and then they run another test. What's this test? All right, how they drink the water, right? So if they go down and either they bring up the water to drink, or they just put their head right in and drink, and that's what separates them. So how many people brought the water up to their face? All right, 300. Why is that a test, by the way? What's being tested here? Okay, they're seeing who's different. What's the test here? Those who... Okay, how does that show they trust in God's power? What's that? I'm sorry. Okay, all right, so that's a common take on it, is that the 300 that bring it up, they're showing vigilance and alertness. Kelly, what were you going to say? Okay, they would be better in battle, that they would be alert and watching. Let me ask this, though. Is that the purpose of the narrowing down? Is God trying to create the best crack squad or elite squad of people possible? His MO typically is to make it about as bad as it can be so that he can what? Show his power. Let me suggest to you an alternate, perhaps, way of thinking of this. Instead of the people bringing it up because they are alert and they know to be watchful, what if they are the cityfied sissy folk who can't put their heads in a stream of water because that's undignified? They've been raised to have something to drink from, so they're going to drink from it. What about the good old country boys? What do? They put their whole head down there and get themselves a drink, because that's what you do when you are out and about. They don't need utensils. They don't need to be, little guys that are lapping it out of their hands. No, they just take a big old drink. Now, here's a question. Who would you rather have with you? The city boys or the big old country boys who know what to do? You better believe it, Joshua. This seems to me to be what the division is. It's, are these people who, they demonstrate by the way that they drink what kind of person they are. And this separation brings about 300 people who probably are the least likely ones that he would want to go into battle with him. And that works. That's what God does again and again and again, doesn't he? He always makes it to where the odds are as far against him as possible so that he can come through. They do, by the way, spoiler alert, in case you haven't read through Judges yet, they defeat the Midianites. But when they do, they're supposed to, at a certain time, shout and beat their swords and have their torches. And, it's supposed to make it seem like there's a huge army. What do they shout? Anybody remember what they shout? All right, for the Lord. Is that it? All right, Josie said it all. Yes, she wasn't supposed to have said it all just yet. Right. Yeah, they shout for the Lord, which is good, but also, and for Gideon, right? So, you kind of have this, hey, this is not just God doing this. Don't forget, guys, me. I'm the one who's leading this as well, because that's what Gideon has them shout. They're victorious, and they come up to Gideon, and they say, hey, Gideon, you were so victorious here. We want to make you king. And what does Gideon say? He says no. Why? Because the Lord is your king. Is that a good answer? Y'all should be nodding real big right now. Absolutely, that's a good answer. No, because the Lord is your king. And then the next thing out of his mouth is, now, by the way, why don't you go ahead and give me a certain share of the spoil and a certain percentage of everything that you just got? Out of however much gold, give so much to me. Why would he do that? Who does that normally go to? That usually goes to the king. In other words, he says, no, don't treat me like a king, but treat me like a king, right? And so you've got this seesaw going on, and really the kicker of all of this, he has how many children? Chapter 8, verse 30. All right, he has 70 sons, for he had what? Many wives. Who multiplies wives and children? Kings do that. He's acting the part of the king. That he said, no, I'm not going to be your king. God's your king. But in every instance, yeah, I'm going to be your king. And then he has a child by a concubine, an illegitimate child compared to the others, but to make sure that this child is given this child's due, this child is named what? Abimelech. And remember, we talked about Abimelech before, and I say Abimelech should not be regarded as a judge because he's not. This does not happen to bring up Abimelech. This happens to raise up Abimelech. By the way, Abimelech, Abi means my father. And what does Melech mean? King. He named his child my daddy's king, right? So, in case you're wondering what he thought about his kingship, where he says, no, I'm not your king, God's your king, but treat me like a king, I'm going to act like a king, I'm going to name my child my daddy's king, so that he's, illegitimate, but I want to make sure that he's given all the proper responses. Yeah, and then you have this thing where Abimelech goes in, like a judge. He goes in, kills all of his brothers so that he will be able to take control, raises up an army, some people, and then it takes the same type of action against him to bring it all to an end. Abimelech is the horrific downfall story that is the result of Gideon's wishy-washy nature. All of this is what leads to a terrible story with Abimelech. Abimelech is not a judge. You move on to the story of Jephthah, and in the story of Jephthah, who is he? Good guy, bad guy? generally? You could use the term dirty, rotten scoundrel, and that fits. He's like a gang leader. He is ostracized by his family because he's an illegitimate child. And so he goes off and he becomes a warlord. And then when Israel comes under problems and duress, God does not raise him up. They go and seek him out. They find him. They bring him back and say, will you help us? And he says, maybe. What's in it for me? He goes, tell you what, you make me your leader, and maybe I'll do this. And so he gets into that. And what we know about Jephthah, more than anything else, is he makes a vow in the midst of the battle. What? What does he say? As I'm returning, the first thing that walks out to greet me, I will sacrifice to the Lord if he gives us a victory. Do they get the victory? Yes, they do. And so as he is returning home, keep in mind their homes on the bottom floor probably had animals in them. I mean, that's the way it was. It's not like a ridiculous type of a thing. It's very possible that an animal would have been the first thing to come out, but instead, what's the first thing that comes out? His only child. It's his daughter, who is, by the way, old enough to grasp what is happening. And he says, this is what I've done. First of all, who does he blame? Himself? Her. Says to her, what have you done? Can't believe you did this to me, that you walked out first before anything else to greet me. What have you done? And so he says, here's my predicament. I've made a vow. I either will sacrifice you in order to keep this vow, or I will break the vow. And it's vague to some degree at the end, but I don't think it's as vague as we often make it. This story is kind of, right before this story, there's been some talk of various gods, some of the gods of the peoples who are in this land that Israel's supposed to be different from. What do they participate in? Child sacrifice. And it's just mentioned that they're supposed to be different from. And then enter the story of Jephthah. And how does the story of Jephthah end? With child sacrifice. This is a clear picture that Israel is no different from the other nations by this point. This is an indication that they may say, why would people ever do these things to worship these gods? And then Jephthah, even though it's somewhat vague, I think we're supposed to understand it. He follows through on his vow. And that, think of the most horrific thing, by the way, in the book of Judges, and that's probably it. There is no pulling punches in Judges. There is no trying to make things better. It's always worst case scenario, especially the further you get down the line. And then we get to the real champion of all of this, Samson. Good guy or bad guy? He's about the worst possible person that you can find in the Scriptures. He is solely about himself and only himself throughout the entirety of this. I mean, there's hardly any redeeming characteristics save for perhaps one moment in his life. The best thing that you can say about Samson, in fact, there was a song that we used to sing at bedtime sometimes about Samson, that he got his strength from his hair. He was a strong person. It's about all that you could really say about him. Nothing about his character at all. By the way, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to throw this out. If you want to know what Samson probably looked like, he probably looked like me. That's my best guess, is that, Samson probably looked about like me. Maybe I'm a little more of a physical specimen than he was, is my guess, possibly. But here's the thing. When Samson would do unbelievable feats of strength, nobody ever looked at him and said, yeah, that checks out. They always said, how? It can't be his muscles. It can't be what he looks like, right? He probably was a scrawny guy who was doing unbelievably incredible things with his strength. That's kind of the basis, because they're always saying, what is the secret? It can't be your physique. There's got to be something else behind this. If an Andre the Giant or somebody did some of these things, we might say, okay, I get it. That makes sense. But not Samson. So, you have him, the beginning of his story. By the way, his story revolves around, to some degree, although one of them is very, very tiny part, 3 women with which he is involved. One is an unnamed Philistine in the beginning. Then you have the prostitute, and then we have the one we're all familiar with, Delilah, at the end. And in all of these instances, it's about selfishness. The beginning with the unnamed woman, we don't have time, which is probably a good thing to talk about Samson. It all begins with him saying, get this woman for me, this Philistine woman, because she is right in my eyes. That's the phrase, but it says she looked good or something like that. I hate that they translate that phrase. She looks right in my eyes is the phrase. And it's important. It's a very important phrase, because that's going to be a phrase that's going to carry through, and already has been in there, what is right in our eyes or right in the eyes of the Lord. But you have a series of revenge that takes place where people keep one-upping each other until finally you just have the depletion of an entire city. And then the Philistines come up against the tribe of Judah. You have a war that's about to start. And then Samson comes in and he takes a jawbone of a donkey, which, by the way, what was he not supposed to touch? Dead things, right? So he picks up a jawbone of a donkey. I'm assuming that he's not holding a live donkey by its jawbone. So this is probably a dead donkey's jawbone. And he is unclean in that way, kills them, all of the Philistines that were there. And then you have the end. Remember, what did they do when they finally captured him with Delilah? What did they do to him? Well, they cut off his hair to capture him, and then they plucked out his eyes. Why? Why is that significant? Not why did they do it, but why is that significant? Because everything for him is about what is right in his eyes. That's what starts all of this. You do what's right in your eyes, and then the eyes are plucked out. And then finally, he is brought to be a demonstration for everyone. His hair's grown back. He prays one last time, give me my strength. It's granted. But remember, what does he say? Give me my strength so that I may what? I want to avenge myself for my eyes, right? What they have done to my eyes. It's still a selfish request, even in the very ending, where at least at this point he puts his faith and trust in God to bring this down. And so he, as he is killing all the Philistines there, a huge mass number, I think it says there's 3,000 just on the roof, so the total of everybody, we're just not sure of, kills all of them in one feat of strength as he kills himself. And then we're going to start next week just very, very, very briefly, because these are a couple stories, one of them in particular that say, yeah, we'll save this for the more mature audience type of discussion. But the last few chapters, 17 through 21, recount two stories that show just how bad things have got by the time of the judges. So, how many of y'all are going to be able to remember that I said we're stopping at 17? There's a good chance I'm going to be like, where did we stop? I feel like we didn't finish Judges. That's probably what I'm going to say. All right, very good. So from there, we got to bring this class to a close and turn things over then to Richard. Thanks a lot, guys.